Horror films rarely get the respect they deserve. It's a genre that's thrown in the basement, along with comedy. However, horror changes our lives and influences our fears, our hopes, and our dreams. Last week, we lost a juggernaut of the industry. Wes Craven passed away. Quietly over the last 6 years, he had been battling with brain cancer. Wes Craven was an icon for many reasons. From his debut with Sean Cunningham, Last House on the Left, to films like Scream, Wes Craven crossed generations. As early as I can remember, from being a child up until being in high school and going on my first date, Wes Craven was always there for me. With films like Shocker, Deadly Friend, Serpent and the Rainbow. All of these films are terrifying. Films like The Hills Have Eyes. People had not seen things like that. It was absolutely mind-blowing. People called him one of the most intelligent and terrifying minds in all of celluloid. And to that, we honor Wes Craven, a true genius, an American maverick of filmmaking. In the 1980s, slasher films had rise to dominance, with the popularity of Halloween kicking it off, and then Friday the 13th in 1980, slasher films were the order of the day. People loved them, and it seemed that just about every weekend you could go to a multiplex and there was a new slasher film opening. However, in 1984, a very small company named New Line Cinema, which had made its mark by distributing films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the porn classic Deep Throat, had put together a film of their own to distribute. And that film was A Nightmare on Elm Street. A Nightmare on Elm Street is a game changer. It is probably one of the best movies, and I'm not just talking horror, let's get out of the horror ghetto for a moment. Probably one of the best movies of the 1980s. Freddy Krueger as a character is just as iconic as Darth Vader, just as iconic as the DeLorean in Back to the Future, or even Gizmo from Gremlins. Later, he would develop into kind of the Henny Youngman or the Rodney Dangerfield of the slasher genre. He was the funny guy of horror. But above all else, it started out with a nightmare. Wes Craven, when he was younger, had seen a homeless man outside of his window. He decided to stare back at him. It terrified him. Had a dirty sweater, a fedora, and a scarred face. And that was a face that looked inside his soul, resonated, and he carried it for many years. So, when 1984 finally rolled around, the little upstart New Line Cinema had finally come out with an answer to Michael Myers, an answer to Jason Voorhees, in the form of Freddy Krueger. Freddy Krueger represented all of our fears. There's so many things that make this film iconic. I mean, just from the references, everybody from Johnny Carson to Ronald Reagan would reference A Nightmare on Elm Street and its titular anti-hero, Freddy Krueger. He had become a part of the pop lexicon. The little film that could went on to make a shit ton of money in the 80s, like it was nobody's business. But just like they say, the first time is always the best time. You have a bunch of kids, they're living in Elm Street, well, excuse me, they live on Elm Street, but they're from Springwood. And Springwood could be any town. It represented the idyllic setting of the suburbs in the 1980s. That kids were safe, and there was really nothing to fear. You could trust having your kids play at the end of the block, and they could come home well after the sun went down. Really, what Nightmare on Elm Street represents is the sins of the parents, the sins of the fathers and mothers who had burned alive a janitor who had possibly, well, depending on who you subscribe to, See, early on, it was written that Freddy Krueger had molested these children, and, as in vigilante justice, the parents of Elm Street and Springwood had decided to take matters into their own hands, burning him alive. What would happen subsequently was that the Springwood slasher would come back. Well, not as a zombie or not as a guy in a hockey mask, but in the dreams and nightmares of the children of Springwood. This urban mythology was so pitch perfect. Nightmare on Elm Street set the tone and the bar for all films that would come after it. This is probably one of my favorite films of all time, and again, not just in the horror genre. I don't know if Wes Craven's going to get a Lifetime Achievement Award, but he does have that, especially in the hearts of fans like myself. It's very hard to think of a world that we're going to live in that doesn't have somebody like Wes Craven to make these types of films. And he's just as important as someone as Steven Spielberg. He might not get the accolades or the kudos that he deserves, but in the hearts and minds of horror fans everywhere, Wes Craven is synonymous with terror. Whether it's The People Under the Stairs or you grew up loving the Scream films, he has crossed genres. He's crossed generations. He's influenced J-horror. He's influenced Italian horror all over the globe, from St. Petersburg, Florida to St. Petersburg, Russia. Everyone knows Wes Craven, and they will never forget his long-lasting legacy. Now, he was making movies far before this, but Nightmare on Elm Street kicked off something that no one could have predicted. A $1 billion franchise. To this day, it continues. They rebooted it once with Jackie Earle Haley, and they're trying to reboot it again. The staying power of someone who can attack you in your dreams, it's just unthinkable. It's every parent's nightmare. It's every child's nightmare. Even when Wes Craven had done his new Nightmare, he was far ahead of the curve. It was the precursor to Scream, being that horror could be meta, and that it could be represented in our real lives. Freddy Krueger is that living embodiment of the boogeyman. See, in Nightmare on Elm Street, we're told the story of Nancy. Nancy's father is a cop, her mother's a drunk, and she's got a crush on a boy next door. A boy who would grow up to become Johnny Depp, who also himself would have claws in Edward Scissorhands. But I digress, because Mr. Depp's fame would come much later as a pirate, of all things. You look at Nightmare on Elm Street, look at the way it's shot. From the opening shots of Freddy building his glove, and that there had been precursors to the glove, to torture, to maim, to rape. This is a terrifying character. So Nancy starts having nightmares. Apparently so are the other kids of Springwood. Nobody wants to go to sleep. Essentially, in the 1980s, there was a movie called Dreamscape. Now, Nightmare on Elm Street director Wes Craven had went to Fox and pitched Nightmare on Elm Street. No studio would touch this film with a 10-foot pole. They found it to be hideous, disgusting, deplorable. But guess what? Somebody decided to rip it off, and that film is Dreamscape. And I enjoy Dreamscape. It's a good flick. The problem was that 20th Century Fox essentially ripped off his idea and turned it into kind of an action-adventure movie. And that was selling the nightmare very, very short. This edition of the Blu-ray came out a few years ago. I highly recommend it. It's in 1080i, it's beautiful, it's loaded with special features. If you're looking for something to find out everything, you probably want to go to The Nightmare Never Ends, The Elm Street Legacy. It's a documentary that was produced by Nancy, who is Heather Langenkamp, and it's about almost 4 hours long. And even that Blu-ray has a ton of special features. You're going to learn everything you need to know about Freddy Krueger and the legacy of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, I picked this up cheap, of all places at a dirty gas station about 2 in the morning. I got this Nightmare on Elm Street Blu-ray for about $5, and it was well worth its weight in gold. You get a ton of special features on this release. Documentaries, commentaries, television spots, radio spots. What's amazing is that A Nightmare on Elm Street still holds up. You can show this movie to a bunch of kids today, and it's still going to freak them out. And that's the testament to Craven's work. That is why we regard him as a legend. You can also pick up the 7 Nightmare films. I mean, the box set is cheap. You're getting, except for Freddy vs. Jason, you're getting all 7 original Nightmare films. You can pick this up for under $25. And on Blu-ray, they're beautiful. Nancy's mother is an alcoholic, and this is a very subtle nod to her ignoring the issue that her and a bunch of other parents had pulled some vigilante justice to murder a child molester. Now, while the reboot played with this idea quite a bit more, the original film was very much so rooted in Freddy Krueger being a child molester. And as the films went on, they got away from that. I don't think there's anything scarier for a child or a parent to have someone touch their children or exploit them in some way. And again, as the series did go on, they got away from those themes. And it's understandable why. No one would ever think that Freddy Krueger would be a Funko Pop, a toy that you would bring home to the kids and sleep with. I mean, it defies all logic that one of our biggest horror icons molested children. It's creepy. The thing is, though, you can't keep a good bad guy down. And that's what A Nightmare on Elm Street is about. They keep Freddy Krueger in the shadows. Robert Englund's performance is pitch perfect. Even under all of this latex and foam, all the special effects they used in the 1980s, they're still relevant. They used a piece of spandex when Freddy is over Nancy's bed and you can see him just kind of prowling over her. That stuff is still effective. The scenes with Tina, again, this parallels Scream where you had Drew Barrymore, spoiler alert, you thought she was going to be the heroine of the film. They even marketed it as such. But the way that Tina in the film dies is so gruesome. Some of this stuff is really hard to watch even now. A Nightmare on Elm Street is just as effective in 2015 as it was in 1984. A lot of times on this show we talk about getting Blu-rays on a budget. Well, I don't care, man. If you gotta pay $20 or you gotta pay $2, A Nightmare on Elm Street is worth its weight in gold. We love you, Wes Craven, and you will be missed. You are a fabric and a part of the American icon. Excuse me. I get a little choked up. It's just, I know that people are maybe not going to miss him the way that I do. But to me, for better or worse, the world is a little bit less scary without Wes Craven. And to me, that's the scariest thing of all.